Hello, I'm Nadiel, and this January the Global Game Jam 2025 happened with people from all over the world joining to make games together in a collective creativity burst. If you don't know what the Global Game Jam, GGJ for short, is, basically it's a worldwide event that happens every year gathering people from more than 100 countries to develop games in a short amount of time. The jam is divided in sites that are organized so that participants can interact with each other either remotely or physically. This year, the event allowed the participants to make their game either in a week or in 48 hours. This is the third game jam I joined, but also my first DGJ. I decided to join the Ship's Meow site, which is a remote site from New Jersey, and participate in the week-long format, which, according to my previous jamming experiences, is by itself a challenging amount of time. For this jam, I wanted to meet new people to work with, and since I plan to start soon, I started looking for teammates right away in the Ship Meow's Discord server. Finding available people was harder than I thought it would be, but some days after the beginning of the jam, I managed to find a composer to work with me. And I also counted with the help of my brother to make some of the game art. It was on Sunday, January 19th, that the theme for this year's jam was revealed. Bubble. Personally, I really like when themes are open like this. It gives room to a lot of creativity from the jammers. One could make a game about conventional soap bubbles, or perhaps make a game about a culture bubble, or even make a game about skin bubbles. To me, what immediately came to mind when I heard the theme was the Bubble Bobble Part 2 game from the NES, which is a very nostalgic game to me since I used to play it with my brother when we were kids. I couldn't help start noting down some ideas right away in a piece of paper. The first concept of the game I had was about a cannon that shoots bubbles and that would be controllable with the mouse, but that didn't quite attract me only by itself. I thought that for this game, I'd want a little more of platforming action, so I thought about a robot that could walk, jump, and shoot bubbles, which was already going a little more in the direction I wanted, with some bits of platforming like the Bubble Bobble game. I kept on thinking about it, and then I decided the main character, instead of being a robot, would be a chameleon, which is an animal I like a lot. I also had the idea that this chameleon would have the ability to trap enemies inside of bubbles and then swallow them with its giant tongue. This would then allow it to transform into that enemy, winning some of the abilities that it had. This idea was heavily inspired by Kirby's games, where the protagonist can swallow enemies and copy their abilities. When having this idea, I immediately also thought of the Yoshi's game, since the chameleon's tongue would be pretty much like Yoshi's. To add even more to the copying idea, I also thought about allowing the player to mix enemy bubbles together to fuse those enemies' powers into another one that could be also swallowed by the chameleon to gain even more abilities at once. After all this ideation, I was pretty inspired to start developing. I started developing the game on the Monday of January 20th. For that, I decided to pick Godot as the game engine to use, since it's my favorite engine at the moment. As the first mechanic, I went straight to the main character's movementation, which is pretty much the most essential feature in the game, being it a platformer. For that, I set up a basic test scene with some placeholder tiles that served as a floor where to walk on. After that, I started working on the chameleon's code itself. It had been some time since I coded a platformer, so I used a bit of Godot's template to get me started. For the chameleon sprite, I used a green square as a placeholder so that I could see it in the screen, and after some tweaking and debugging, I had a character that could walk around and jump. Next, I started developing the mechanic that made my game fit the theme of the game jam after all, the bubbles themselves. For them, I initially used a placeholder sprite I I quickly made with Figma. Initially, I was going to program the bubbles as rigid bodies, but then I realized they would be affected by gravity. So to have more fine-tuned control over their behavior, I decided to make them character bodies. One of the first features of the bubble was having the ability to burst after a set amount of time, so that they don't stay floating forever. After the bubbles, I started working on the chameleon's tongue, which it can shoot to burst the bubbles. For that, I also used the placeholder sprite from Figma. At this point, I noticed I'd have a lot of character body derived objects in the game, so I made a custom entity class to centralize their code. Next, it was time for the chameleon to be able to shoot bubbles. I struggled a bit with how I'd find the mouse position so that the player could point where he wants the bubble to go, but I found a quick tutorial in the Godot docs that helped me out. Such tutorial provided a very concise way of getting the mouse position, which consists of a simple call to getViewport.getMousePosition. Later in the project, when I started utilizing the camera, this approach didn't work anymore though, but we'll come to it later. The bubbles were now spawning when needed, but they were colliding unexpectedly with the player. So after searching a bit about collision layers and masks, which I always seem to forget what the difference is, I figured out a setup that would make them not hit each other while still colliding with walls. The next day of development started, and the first thing I did was make the bubbles bubblier. To give them such an effect, I added an animation that plays once they spawn and makes them appear stretchy, and also updated their texture to use one from a bubble sprite spec I very conveniently found on itch.io. Now it was time to make it so the bubbles could capture enemies. For that, I added a sprite to the bubbles that would show an icon with what's the current enemy that it's got, and started making a placeholder of a mouse enemy so that I could test this bubble's ability. Next, I used the custom area 2D to make it so bubbles could detect enemies and store their data to simulate a capture mechanic. At this point, I decided it was time to adjust the movement of the entities and even more of the player, since that's one of the main aspects of a platformer. To achieve that, I defined common logic and variables in the entity class that could be customized by the chameleon and by enemies in the way it's needed in order for them to have a better feel. Back to the development, I implemented a mechanism that allows the bubbles to burst and emit a knockback to nearby entities by using another area 2D. At this point though, the bubbles had an issue that made them stop abruptly when sliding on the floor, which after some testing I found out was being caused by them having the motion mode set to grounded. Finally, I finished the chameleon's tongue, which would be the final piece when it comes to the platforming part of the game. Since for this game I wanted a more modern style when it comes to art and sounds, I thought that maybe it would be easier to try and make some SFX myself, and that's what I did. It's the first time I tried creating so many SFX, and it was tons of fun. I recorded a couple of moth-made noises with my phone and then cropped them at the right spots so that I could put them in the game. I made sure to record more than one audio for each effect so that they wouldn't sound so repetitive, and I also used audio stream randomizer, which proved to be very useful to get random SFX each time they play in the game. When playing sounds of notes that were being read from memory, like the one of the bubble disappearing, I found out that its node was being deleted from the game before its SFX could even play. After thinking a bit, I came up with a global audio manager script so that this component would be responsible for playing sounds that need to be independent of node life cycles. The end of the jam was already approaching, and the game still didn't have an objective for the players to achieve, so that's what I started working on next. Previously, my plans were that the player would need to eat all enemies in the level in order to advance, similar to how it is in Bubble Bubble. Time was passing though, and I figured I wouldn't have time to implement different enemies. So I came up with a collectible idea that would substitute the enemies as the requirement to complete stages. This collectible would be a golden beetle that the chameleon needs to eat. In order to do that, the player would first need to trap that beetle inside a bubble and then eat that bubble with the beetle inside. The deadline was already getting pretty close, so I had to make some cuts to the scope of the project. The main feature I had to cut was the fusing enemies ability of the chameleon, which it would be able to do by making bubbles with enemies collide. Since I had given up on the idea of implementing different types of enemies, the game pretty much didn't have any dangers that the player would need to avoid. That's why I decided to add some spikes that, once touched by the player, would automatically restart the level, making them a really dangerous obstacle. To make my life easier when it comes to setting them up in the levels, I save them in a tile set as scene tiles, which facilitates the process of laying them down in the level. At this point, I was facing some issues with the mouse positioning in the levels, since the levels now had cameras that moved around. The detection of the mouse position wasn't working as it was in the static levels. Thankfully, I found someone in Reddit that had come up with a solution that worked in this game. The solution was that instead of getting the mouse position from the viewport directly, like the solution I saw in the docs, it should be calculated from the local mouse position of the camera node and then summed with the camera's position. This was already the day before the last day of the jam, but I wanted very hard to upload the game before the last day, since the Global Game Jam site usually lags too much at the deadline. That's why for this day, I reserved a lot of time to complete the level design of the game and put together the credits screen. Given the shortage of time, I decided to opt out of making a menu, so in the final version, the player jumps directly to the gameplay. Despite that, I only managed to create the games page on the Global Game Jam site, but not upload it yet. Thankfully though, I managed to upload it the next day. Finally, the last day of the jam arrived, and I rushed to make the final adjustments of the game that I could, like importing the assets the composer and my brother made and fixing some bugs that I found. At the end, I decided to call the game Terra's Terrarium. My idea is that the chameleon's name is Terra, and the game happens inside a terrarium in which it lives. Unhappily, I didn't have time to implement some of the main concepts of the game, like the enemy fusing and the chameleon copying their powers. But overall, I'm pretty happy with how the game turned out. I also didn't have time to implement a lot of the levels, so I made sure the ones that I made were hard enough to make them feel longer. Though they do have some very easy ways of completing that make the game completable in under a minute. In the Ship's Meow site, they also organized a game showcase in their Discord server, which I wanted to participate, but unhappily I didn't have a mic available to present my game with. Thankfully though, I'm able to share my game and development process here with you all watching. That's the end of the devlog about the Global Game Jam 2025. Thank you very much for watching. This was my first devlog here on YouTube, so I hope this video was interesting for you. If you're interested in trying out Terra's Terrarium, you can check it out on itch.io. Its link is available in the description.